Hi.
Hey, um, so hi, thanks for taking the time for this mock.
Yeah, thank you
Uh,
for interviewing.
yeah, so I'll quickly, just very briefly introduce me, and then we can kind of, just go into maybe like two case studies that you might expect um, in in like your actual interview. So yeah, so I've been a data scientist uh, at a company like similar to Uber, and that's kind of what we're going to discuss. And I regularly interview for my firm, so which is why I just help out folks for the mock. So uh,
Sounds good.
I- yeah, so having said that, let's kind of dive into one. Uh, so let's talk about let's start with Uber Eats. So I assume you're familiar and have used the app a lot, right?
Yeah, I've used Uber Eats to place a few orders.
Okay. So so right now Uber Eats is pretty like well established business model. We have a lot of like drivers and delivery partners. But let's talk about like couple of years before.
Hmm.
So the scenario is that Uber right now, Uber Eats, the drivers are only using, you know, cars and bikes maybe to like or like deliver food. And now we want to introduce like scooters, so like electric scooters and stuff. So uh, yeah, so we want to understand if that is a good idea or not, and how to kind of understand uh, what can be the pros and cons, and understand how would we implement this. So this is kind of the broader question you have. Let's say the VP of logistics or VP of operations comes to you, and they're thinking about this idea. So as a data scientist, what would the first step that will kind of think about?
I see. I see. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for sharing the context here. So before I dive into the problem solving, I just want to set up, maybe a structure for answering this question, and so we can collaborate on it. So the
Sure.
first part of it, I'm going to ask you a lot of clarifying questions to understand the goals of us wanting to, introduce scooters, and not just rely on cars and things like that, right? Just understand more about the business context, and hopefully by understanding this, we can, come up with some ways to measure, what it is what we're trying to do. On if you're running some experiments down the line, we have some understanding of the metrics we need to focus on. And then once I ask those clarifying questions, establish goals and metrics, then we can go into, sort of like the method of how we are going to do it, right? Maybe it's an A/B test, maybe it's some optimization problem, maybe it's some simple data analysis. But at the end of it, we'll move on to some business recommendation. In this case, how do we implement this change, right? So if that
Okay.
makes sense as a structure to you,
Yeah, that
I'd
sounds
like
good.
to
Yeah.
ask you a few questions, right? So my understanding of the scenario is Uber Eats right now is in its early stages, and it has delivery drivers who use mostly cars. And you want to sort of expand your driver pool, let's say, and include people who may not have cars and who may have things like scooters or bikes or stuff like that. And is that the entire scope of it? And do you have, reasons why you want to do that? Is it just to simply increase the driver pool, so that you have more volume of drivers to meet uh, nearby deliveries? Or could you help me understand more of why your Uber Eats is now thinking about this?
Yeah, so very good question. So yeah, we have, let's say, historically been predominantly delivering by cars, and now we're
Mhm.
thinking of it's a good idea to use other areas. First, we'll start with, let's say, scooters, e-scooters, and then we
Mhm.
might even try out other areas later, like bikes, e-bikes, whatever. But right now we're thinking about like scooters, and kind of wanted to know your and the so one reason is definitely what you said, like we can get more drivers. Can you think of any other areas where we might want to do that?
Yeah. So I could think of a few hypotheses, like, more drivers is one thing, but ultimately what more drivers would get us is, reduction in our ETA, right? Like faster deliveries. might be an app, might be something related to having more drivers, right? So
Um,
if you have more drivers, maybe you have somebody to pick up the order faster. And if it's a close by delivery, that could be one thing. And you might be seeing, things like there are more nearby orders being placed. And maybe another hypothesis could be like, in cities, there's a lot of traffic involved, and maybe you're seeing a lot of orders from very close by restaurants, but maybe it's getting turned down because of the traffic, and you would prefer to have somebody more mobile than somebody with a car where they have to worry about parking and stuff like that. So that could be one thing, like just having more accessible uh, modes of transport in cities.
yeah, I mean, all very, very valid points. Yeah. So yeah, so that's kind of exactly why we want to do it. We want to see if, trying out something like this can reduce uh obviously our delivery times because of big cities, cluster and traffic. So that's kind of the reason
Mhm.
we are trying to go ahead with this.
I see. So I'm just writing down, some of my hypotheses
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
here.
Yeah.
So essentially, we've listed down four separate hypotheses, right? And I think ultimately, when you're looking at it, and these are all, some of it might, these are all, except for hypothesis one, everything is more sort of customer facing, right? Where you want faster deliveries, and there's some interrelation, like relationship between all of these. You want faster deliveries, and we think this scooters might get us there because we think it's applicable more in cities than in suburban areas, and we think that the traffic related delays or the parking related delays all just go away because there are more people who might be uh, on scooters who can do the job better. So if that seems like a good hypothesis, um, and is it also fair to assume that we are sort of piloting this in cities because the driving distances in suburbs might just be like unreasonable?
Yeah, I mean, we can kind of go with the assumption that when we might, I mean, we can get into that later, but yeah, I mean, you can assume that right now. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So the way I'm thinking about it is, we've listed some hypotheses here, mostly from a consumer perspective. Um, and we can start thinking about some metrics that might validate these hypotheses, sort of like,
Sure.
you know, um, I can think of metrics like, say, something like uh, maybe the average time to deliver.
So so uh, let's kind of start with like success metric, like so.
Yeah.
What would be like your primary success metric here?
Yeah, yeah. So for these things, right, we are saying that because we have more, we have people who are more mobile, they might be doing a better job. To me, that means that the average delivery time has gone down. For example, the time between order being ready for pickup and the time to actually, mark the order as delivered, right? The time
Sure.
difference between
Sure.
those two timestamps is going to be lower for people on these modes of transport versus other cars and stuff like that for these particular geographies where it is actually sensible to have scooters.
Fair enough.
So
Okay.
average time to delivery is what I'm looking at for certain populations.
Okay. Sure. Uh,
um, so one of the constraints that I want to talk about is, I just talked about success metric. Is that first of all, is that a fair success metric?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a very valid success metrics. Yeah, that's. I mean, you
My
can have some
Mhm.
more as well. You should probably also track a couple of other metrics if you want to. But
Yeah,
this, yeah, this is okay. Probably
yeah,
one of the primary success metrics, I would say. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, if I were to think of other metrics, there are a couple of directions I would think in.
Okay.
One, in terms of, say, the delivery person, right? They are also involved in this process, and the merchant is also involved in this process, right?
Exactly.
The
Exactly.
restaurant
Yeah.
person. So
Yeah.
maybe there's something related to merchants and the driver that we need to be thinking about. For example, are more people on scooters rejecting these orders for some reason or the other, right? So maybe order rejection rate from the delivery person is something I'd look at, and consequently, maybe there's some negative impact on the restaurant order completion or something.
Are there
I don't know.
any reasons why you can think why people in scooters might be rejecting more orders? Any things you can think of?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on um, the distance involved. For example, it might be unreasonable for somebody to say bike, I don't know, 10 miles to make a single delivery, right? Or maybe even if you're batching deliveries, or if the delivery order is too huge and it's unwieldy for a scooter like um, vehicle, right? Like it's a 10-person order or something, right? And you're on your bike and it's not convenient for you to carry, maybe you'll reject it. Or maybe the order won't get completed because you just realize the logistics, you just can't physically do it, right?
Yeah.
So that might be one of the reasons, whereas in a car you can just load it and you can be on your way. So distance, size of the order, I think all makes a difference for people on scooters.
Yeah, I think very valid points. Fair enough.
So I would sort of make that a guardrail metric, saying that, just in general, the delivery person's, um, how do I say, delivery rejection rate.
Yeah, we can call it like we can actually call it like, let's say, acceptance rate.
I
Like,
see. Delivery acceptance rate
yeah.
is one. And maybe on the other side of it is delivery completion rate, right? They might have accepted it and they may not complete it because it just ultimately proved to be too much of a distance or too heavy of a load or something.
That's yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So these are a couple of different ways I can think about it, right? And maybe
So
if I had
a,
to, sorry,
a
go on,
small
please.
a small follow up. So you said completion rate. So uh, you say that acceptance is when they feel an order is too big or too long or whatever, and they don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if they do accept, then the completion rate can be low. That now they cannot fulfill it. So
Yeah.
do you think these metrics are they are like complementary or they're like supplementary? How do you think these two metrics kind of work together?
I think they give the complete picture, right? Like one is sort of in advance, right? And the other is post. So it's sort of like a pre-post thing. One is like, okay, this distance seems too large, so I'm going to reject, like not accept it in the first place. And maybe they overestimate, what they can do, accept it, and then end up not being able to complete it, at like maybe somebody in a car would have been able to, right? And the toll was too much for them. So it helps tell the full picture, in my opinion.
Okay, so
Is that fair?
basically, yeah. So I'm just asking, like, if do you think like if one were to go high, the other were to go low, or if one were to go high, the other would also go up?
Uh, I think if the acceptance rate goes down, maybe the completion rate goes up because, now the people are more selective and they are only taking orders they can fulfill better. And so, you might see it, an inverse sort of relationship happen,
Yeah,
but maybe
that,
not in all cases, but, we'll see.
fair fair enough. Yeah. So okay, so let's go ahead. So you have defined like one success metric and one guardrail metric. Any other metrics you want to look at, or that's kind of it?
Yeah. So you could also look at, so I'm trying to think of what else I can think maybe from a consumer perspective. Um, yeah, I'm struggling to come up with more metrics for the consumer. Maybe it could be some, again, these could be more guardrail metrics than success metrics for the consumer, where if we see some reduction in, say, their engagement post delivery from a scooter person, right? Um, that might be something. But again, I think that we might get to that just from the average time to deliver. Like we already might have data that if time to deliver goes up, maybe the retention goes down or something. So I'm hoping we already have that data.
That's true, but I mean, that's more of a company-wide macroeconomic thing. Like for this test specifically, you can still track it as a secondary metric. I mean,
I see.
that's a very valid point.
Okay, yeah.
So
So I would track retention on
okay,
platform.
fair enough. No, that's a very good point. Um, any other metrics or like you mentioned earlier, like incentives and ideas from the merchant side. So
Yeah.
any ideas like from the merchants that are completing the orders?
Yeah, yeah. So for me, it doesn't immediately stand out that the merchants would know straight away what their mode of transport is, or whether they'd actually care if somebody's picking it up from a scooter or not. Um, the only way I think the merchants come into play is how Uber Eats might function, right? Uber Eats might be batching a lot of orders from a same restaurant, right, to the same dasher, sorry, to the same deliverer. And so if Uber Eats say knows that you're on a scooter and I'm on a car, maybe I'm given 10 orders and you are given one order. And if there are more sort of, scooter people showing up at a particular restaurant, maybe they'd feel like, hey, the volume is not there, or maybe it's too inconvenient for them because there are more of these scooter people coming on. And maybe they drop off because the experience is not that great, because they have to,
What's the, I mean,
yeah.
so I mean, so what's kind of the metric that you are mentioning here?
Yeah, so I'm looking at merchant retention also. In addition to consumer retention, I'm looking at merchant retention.
Okay, so the merchants can go off platform if they are.
Yeah. So merchants might churn if they have to deal with way more, delivery folks than they're used to handling, just because they can't carry as much.
Okay, fair enough.
So
Uh,
is there any angle that you're particularly looking for that I'm missing here?
no, I think this is good. I mean, yeah, I mean, this is just a mock. We can go into the feedback part later as well. But yeah, I
Okay,
think this is good. Like this is all very good metrics to kind of focus on.
sounds good.
Um,
So I guess, like, ultimately, taking a step back, your question was, how do we implement a scooter solution, or how do we even tell if it's successful or not, right? And for a lot of these questions, my gut reaction is to say that, you probably need some kind of A/B testing here, where you're trying
sure.
to, reject a certain null hypothesis. For example, if we chose as our primary success metric average time to deliver, right?
Yeah.
And we're choosing certain cities where we've implemented this program, then I'd say our null hypothesis is that, the delivery time remains the same. And the alternate hypothesis is that the delivery times are actually lower because there's a more mobile form of delivery than just cars.
Okay. So
Time.
yeah, so let's say we want to implement this A/B test. So how will you kind of go about implementing this test?
Yeah, for sure. So in general, in A/B testing, we're sort of uh, assigning randomly our subjects to a test and control group, and deciding a certain level of, type 1 and type 2 error that we are comfortable with, calculating a sample size, and then sort of waiting for the result. And that result, and that waiting period might just depend on how much data velocity you have in that company, right?
Okay.
Here, what I'm concerned about is that, how do we randomize our A/B test properly? And what do I mean by that? For example, um, in Uber Eats, right? If say I um, am placing an order and it's going to yeah, I'm just thinking about what I'm trying to see if there's some network effect related to, consumers.
No, that's a very good point. So, I mean, network effects are always a case, but I think, yeah, we can actually worry about that part later. So, when you're trying to
Yeah,
design the test, like how do you go about it?
yeah,
So
yeah,
so you mentioned randomization.
yeah.
Uh,
So
like,
in in this case, so maybe, randomization does not, it maybe Yeah, I'm not sure what we can randomize here, right? Like, because we just onboard people who drive scooters,
Yeah,
right? So there isn't any test and control being done on scooters. You're comparing them against cars, sort of. So in
yeah,
this
yeah,
case, maybe you're just comparing two different groups. Maybe you're not necessarily running an A/B test per se.
sure.
Um,
Uh,
but I I don't know. I feel like we can still run an A/B test by saying that certain orders from customers will go to the scooter group and certain orders from customers will go to the cars group. And which orders will go to the scooter and which orders will go to the cars will be randomly chosen. So
yeah, so I think so. Basically, for that, it's kind of a different question. That uh, then the question becomes like, are you going to run this test on existing like deliverers, drivers, or you're going to run this test on new? Because
yeah,
that's kind of how, or it could be both. So
yeah,
that's kind of how you know decide the test. So that's
yeah,
what the question comes down to then.
I see. So for me, right, like I'd say that we are onboarding cohorts of new delivery people, um, and their behaviors would be similar, right? Like more experienced people would deliver in very different ways than, newly onboarded people.
Mhm.
So I'd say take a group of newly onboarded scooter folks and newly onboarded, say, cars folks, and that's who you're randomly assigning to. Is that sort of a fair approach?
Uh, Newly onboarded scooter folks, but we haven't really launched people who have scooters yet. So this is a feature we are launching when people cannot deliver a scooter. So we don't really existing have a base of people who have scooters. So
I
uh,
see.
yeah, people, I mean, everybody will have cars. The only difference is
Yeah.
they are either delivery with,
So
yeah.
yeah, so in that case, maybe I misunderstood the question, right? And I was thinking about how do we roll it out and measure success? Um, is the question more around how do we validate this idea even before proceeding to the rollout phase?
No. So I mean, so you kind of got the question like pretty much right. So we want to see if this is a good idea, right? So we haven't really rolled it out yet. It's only by cars, and now we're thinking about launching scooters. So
Yeah,
now we agreed to success metrics, which is everything right, all good. Now we want to test it out. Now you
yeah,
mentioned A/B test, right? So
yeah,
basically now testing which A/B test means some 50% of people like we choose a cohort,
yeah,
50% of them we now
yeah,
have the option of delivering via scooter, and the rest 50% don't.
yeah,
That's how it's gonna be.
yeah,
That's how the test will be done.
yeah, yeah. So this is not scooter is what I meant. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. That's fine. Yeah, then is like okay. Then that's yeah, cool. So basically, you want to run a test like on a cohort of existing users. fifty
Yeah,
percent of them, let's say, will have the option of delivering via scooters, and
yeah,
50% of them won't. Okay.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
How will you like? How big of a cohort will you select? Like, how will you select how big of a sample size do you
Yeah, so I would say the sample size calculation is based on whatever your type 1 and type 2 error thresholds are.
Okay.
In general, you set maybe a type 1 error of, like 0.05, and type 2, you sort of want a power of 80%. And you can work backwards from there, with the 50-50 split, what that sample size would be. I don't exactly remember the formula right now, but that's how I'd go about it.
Okay. So you like type one, type two errors is one thing. What else can be like a factor in like determining, how big of a size you want to?
Yeah. So one of the things is like how much data you have to work with, right? For example, um, yeah, so the effect size that you're looking for is also another thing. For example, maybe a 1% effect size doesn't really move the needle for the company, and maybe a 5% effect size does. And so if
Yeah.
that's the effect that you're looking for, that will also sort of, inform your sample size.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Anything else?
Um, yeah, so this is what would formally go into the math of calculating the sample size, but I can also think that maybe something like, if you're getting 1 million customers in a week, right, then you will have no trouble building up the data. But
Mm-hmm.
if you're getting like very few customers in a week,
True.
uh, then maybe the experiment would run a long time if you're looking for, very I don't know, very precise type 1 and type 2 errors, or if you're looking for a certain effect size. So I don't know, maybe I'd look at the data velocity as well, just to understand how
Okay,
long
yeah,
this experiment would run,
yeah,
just to sort of inform that calculation.
that makes sense. So let's say, so just kind of on the thought, so we did sizing. So what factors or what things can determine whether this test will be success or not? So let's kind of get into that now.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I think there's a few things about, experimental um, design that we need to be cautious about. Like
Yep.
we got into network effects a little bit, but we didn't really, talk a lot about it. But essentially,
True.
it's like there is something happening in our experiment where the test and control independence is sort of violated.
Okay.
And maybe that might happen because, you know, uh, I don't know, a person that was not having a scooter saw somebody who has a scooter. Maybe they decide to switch to a scooter as a mode of transport. And, now they're both in both test and control. Or maybe,
Yeah. Okay.
or something like that, where the independence is sort of violated, you know? Um,
Okay. So
or, yeah,
that's one thing. Any other things that you can think of? What? So we have. So think about like how are you implementing the test? Like, how exactly are you rolling out to the test audience? Like think about the
yeah,
actual tactics and then think about what things can be important in making this test a success or not.
yeah. So um, I would say that you'd want to ensure that you're rolling it out to some uh, um, geography that it makes sense, right? Like to cities or something like that. So you want to make sure you're controlling for possible confounding factors, right? Maybe the behavior in suburban areas is completely different.
True.
um, and so just have a list of those controlling factors, so
Fair
cities
enough.
versus suburban areas,
Fair
and
enough. Fair enough.
maybe
So
something like that.
yeah, so makes sense. So let's kind of go ahead. And so let's say the test was kind of a success that you
Yeah,
were able to generate like a minimum, like a significant enough lift,
yeah,
and your check metrics aren't that bad. So
yeah.
what's kind of the next strategy now? So what's kind of the next step now?
Yeah, so for me it's like, okay, I know this test was successful, but I also kind of want to check and validate that the results are true, right?
Okay.
I would go through my experimental data to see that, okay, there isn't some confounding factor. It was truly independent. The, split was 50-50.
Sure.
And if you're and I would also run it by the PM or the logistics up, manager, to see, okay, does this lift, is this actually valuable to the business, right? Like there's
Fair enough.
5% that we see from this lift. Is this worth it to, spend a bunch of marketing money on boardings, increasing the supply of scooter folks or something like that? So you need to do some kind of cost benefit analysis to make sure that the 5% lift is actually profitable for the business. So I would move on to that sort of stage to understand, should we scale it out. I'd also understand if there are pockets where the experiment wasn't successful, right? Like this is an aggregate metric. I would try to, cut it by different dimensions, like,
Fair
cities,
enough.
suburbans, etc., just to see that, okay, in certain areas this doesn't scale well, or this is just lagging behind the control group. So just make sure you go through your experimental data,
Fair enough.
validate it, run some cost benefit analysis, and then make the
And
appropriate recommendation.
let's say it was right. So let's say you run by the PM, the numbers make
Yeah,
sense to you. What's the
yeah,
next step?
yeah. So I think, like, at this point, I'd assume that, we got a green light to roll out this, product, and say, hey, we're getting
Hmm.
scooter folks onboarded, and things like that. The next step is obviously to make sure that the results pull through, right? And whatever 5% lift or that we saw in the A/B test has to pull through to the whole business when we start scaling. So that
Right.
would be my next priority. And I would think of ways we can sort of ensure that happens. For example, maybe I'd ask for, I don't know, maybe I'd start thinking about what is our baseline and what would be our anticipated lift, like sort of a pre-post measurement, accounting for some trends and things like that. Maybe I,
how will you
yeah,
do that? So you have the small, you ran like a small test at the stat sake.
yeah,
You have a lift. How will you estimate the lift for like 100% rollout? How will you do that
yeah,
calculation?
yeah, yeah. So I mean, for me, I'd say that the very simple thing would be to just scale it, right? If to the total number, okay, we ran it for 5% of the population, right? And if we had to do it for the 100%, we just multiplied by 20. But the problem of doing that is there are a lot of confounding variables like trends and things like that. Maybe in December, the orders aren't that much, and we ran the experiment in December or things like that. So I would say that first, figure out what your baseline metric is, right? In these particular areas where we are scaling to, say the baseline metric here is like on average, it takes 20 minutes uh, to deliver, and we are seeing that it would drop to 18 minutes in say uh, I don't know, in the test group. To understand what would happen to the overall company-wide delivery metric, um, I
Hmm.
would look at, I don't know, I would look at different points in time, right? Like maybe at 6 o'clock, the delivery time is higher or lower. So I'd have to get to that granular level and then extrapolate from there for each sort of segment. That's kind of how I'd do it. Is that a fair approach?
No, that's a very fair approach. I think that's pretty much how that's definitely like looking at baseline numbers and then extrapolating how what features can be that. I mean that's kind of how to do it. Makes sense.
Okay.
So on like a follow up. So this is we are assuming the impact on business when the testing is successful. It
Yeah.
makes sense to roll out.
Yeah.
What would be next step if the test wasn't successful? Like we did not actually get a statistic result. What's
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and and it's almost the same process, right? Like we want to see if there's some Simpsons paradox or something going on with confounding factors, right? So maybe something was causing it. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the control group is what was getting all the promos for some reason, and they're the ones
true,
placing all the
true.
orders. Or so just figure out, did it actually fail or not would be the number one thing. And even
Okay.
if it did fail, right, and we have some solid hypothesis why it should work, it's
Mhm.
it's on us to, maybe change how different parts of the funnel work. For example, are we bringing on board the right scooter folks, right?
Mm.
Or maybe we'd look at different parts of the funnel to see where could the problem be and try to fix it from there rather than saying, hey, this is a failure. So I, go into sort of a diagnostic kind of mindset.
Okay, cool. Fair enough. So I think, yeah, so I think with that, I think we are at the uh, end of the case study.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
so overall, so let me kind of get into the nuances. So overall, I think very well done, honestly. You
Thank you.
covered a lot of things, like starting from the top till the end, like both width and depth. By that I mean like covering both areas of, covering of various answers of a particular question, and also going deep to figure out a lot of nuances with it. Having said that, uh, do want to maybe point out a couple of things. So let's start on the top. So I think when I mentioned this exact case study, you mentioned like a structure which is perfect. That's what Intuits always look for. A structure is like very important. You had that. You had a lot of clarifying questions, which is great. I went into why should we be rolling this out. You said a reduction in time, more drivers, short distance, big city parking, nailed it. Uh, you went into metrics, average time, nailed it. That's how typically it would go about. You mentioned three-sided areas. That's how we do it. You said acceptance rate. That can be one thing. And then for the merchant side, you said merchant retention, which is good. I think there can be a couple of things that you can think about in terms of check metrics. So, and here is another thing where network effect comes in. So basically, uh, when we are rolling out such a test, so now people have another mode of transport, right? So we can have a lot more dashers now, right? So A lot more dashers mean less waiting time for the customer, but it can also mean more idle time for the, I mean, for the drivers. So now the drivers can have more idle time, right? Because there are just way too many drivers. So that can be one problem of launching this feature. So you want to make sure that there, because you mentioned acceptance rate or rejection rate as a check metric, but the other is think to also think about it is idle time.
Yeah.
They simply
Okay.
are more idle. And also it is uh, about for the merchant side, you mentioned retention. I think they merchants for incentive them is that if there are more delivery people, they can probably deliver more orders. So just
Mhm.
more order completion. I think I would personally, I mean, because these are not primary, these are secondary metrics, so they are a bit more subjective. But I think just simply more order volume can be like a good factor, because at the end of the day, merchants care about total volume, like how many orders they're getting.
Mhm.
So they can obviously focus on that.
I see.
And there is also another thing that I think is, it's not always important, but can be a good metric, is like ratings. So
I
if
see.
merchants can rate DoorDash, sorry, I mean Uber Eats,
Yeah.
customers can rate the
Yeah.
orders,
I
stuff
I
like that.
I chose not to mention ratings because I felt like maybe like 10% of the people or something actually
Well,
give
that's true.
ratings and
That's true. That's true. I think so. So the data shows that people don't rate when the order is fine. But they always rate when the order is bad.
I see.
Then the rating percentage is probably as high as 50 to
So it's
80%.
probably skewed negative, right?
Yeah, I mean that's always the case. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
which is why we always take that into account whenever we show the rating. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's fine. So these were a couple of things, and then we went into testing. As you mentioned, randomization, sizing. You mentioned type 1 and 2, all
Mhm.
good. All you nailed all that stuff. You mentioned effect size, which we call minimum detectable effect.
Mhm.
Perfect. You talked about traffic and data dictating, length of experiment, nailed it. One thing which I think you missed, which is kind of important, and I was trying to hint towards it, was adoption. So basically, how it works is, and which is I was trying to send you think about how exactly it would work for the people. So adoption means how we launch a test. Now we will launch it in our app. They will get a notification or a feature that you can select a scooter, right,
Mhm.
as like a delivery option. But now adoption thing is, first of all, how many people are aware of that marketing, how many people see that, how many people actually have a scooter to begin with that they can do it, and then how many people actually end up using a scooter.
I
So
see.
there is a whole funnel for adoption as well, that kind of goes into it. So I tried to hint it, I think, couple of times, but I mean that's fine. You probably were just missing that, I think, angle, which is why you kind of missed it. But yeah, so these are the things that uh, for any test, unless and until it's something that we are automatically changing on their side, if it's something that they have to accept and they have to work on, then there isn't always a thing of like adoption percentage, how many people
I
actually end
see.
up doing that, how many people are even aware of this. Because something like this, we'll do marketing, but you can't do like, you can't run a TV ad or a radio ad, right? Because this is supposed to
Yeah.
be person control. So
Yeah.
this has to be something within the app, within email, and not everybody reads the email, not everybody sees the app notifications. So there is always like a lot of drop off over there.
I
And then
see.
maybe 90% of the drivers, they probably don't have a scooter. So that reduces your your possible
Yeah.
size by a lot. So that's also, I tried to mention that in the sizing, like what other things we'll think of. So that's fine, because this is
I
also
see.
thing you have to think of, like how many people do you expect to have a scooter in the first place, right? They are the only
Yeah.
ones who actually end up
That's right. Yeah.
coming with a scooter.
Yeah.
So these things are just like just small areas that you can kind of think of. And then we went into how to, if the result is successful, you said run by the PM, which areas wasn't it successful, all good. I think what I was also next steps, like which you kind of did mention, but maybe didn't go deep enough, is like how the rollout strategy. So we started with like, we did one test. I think I was thinking that we did one test in probably, let's say, one city. So the next thing would be to try it out in suburbs, see the results, try it in,
Mhm.
maybe we did it in SF in New York City. Now you want to do it in slightly somewhere maybe like Detroit, Atlanta, and other cities to see if the numbers hold, if the metrics hold.
Mhm.
And once you have some, it's not like all tests will be successful. City tests won't be same as suburb tests. So maybe
Mhm.
then the recommendation will be only to launch it in big cities within a radius of, I mean, I don't know, like 20 miles from like this city center, or from downtown, something like
Mhm.
that. So it kind of depends on how you test it out, and then you launch it to everybody. And 100% rollout means everybody now has a feature of delivering with a scooter or a car. So that's what like 100% rollout is. So I think that's like a small just addition. And but I think
I
otherwise
see. Thanks for clarifying that.
yeah, that's fine. And otherwise, you covered like baseline numbers, all good, nailed it. That is what, whenever a test is successful, we work with the finance and the leadership to kind of plan it out. What is the next step? How do we go about it? What numbers make sense? Even if the test is successful in a city, doesn't mean that lift is, business wise makes sense for the whole citywide national rollout, because there is a lot more marketing that needs to be done. So that cost effectiveness needs to be taken care into. And that's obviously not our call, but it's important to keep those things into account. So that's good. And then we talked about what if the test is not good, not positive. You mentioned contamination of test and control. Again, very good points. Simpson's paradox. That is something that people rarely ever mention. Like I have been conducting those, I've never heard of it. So that's a very good point you mentioned. But I think some other things are which are kind of intuitive, which is why some people kind of forget to mention, is like which is the same thing around like not enough data. Like maybe people simply didn't sign up, people didn't adopt enough, not enough people were aware of it. And the just test is not successful doesn't mean there is no lift. It's just that right now you don't have enough data to say that you can generate a, let's say, a lift of 10%. Maybe your lift was a lift of 5% can be generated. So even though that is a bit implicit and a bit intuitive always in a test, but it's always good enough to mention it if the test is not successful, because these kind of are some additive points that you can add on your kind of.
I see. Okay.
So that's kind of how we kind of go about it.
I see. Okay.
Just a second. So we are kind of almost at the 1 hour mark. It's kind of finishing up. So I mean, the rest of the case study and the Python and SQL stuff, maybe we can do like a separate interview for that. But yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, this was very helpful. Like, you pointed out a lot of things in what I should be looking for in the adoption funnel, things like what I should look for if the test fails or I'm not seeing the results I should be looking. And, you gave me the interviewer's perspective on what I should look for. So that was pretty awesome. Yeah. And, I'd really appreciate if you can go over one more case study and maybe some SQL and Python. That would really help me out.
Yeah, I mean, we probably might need another interview because I think this case study did go a bit long, but typically the onset case studies do run that long. So do keep in mind, like we sometimes try to in one mock we can do maybe two, but a typical case study does run that because there's a lot of nuances, there's a lot of depth in every number, in every thing that you mentioned. So we covered like maybe like 45-50 minutes. I mean, that's typically how long your actual interview goes as well. So I think you can expect something like this in the actual interview. So yeah, I think you did
okay.
So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, all the best for the process, and yeah, see you in the next interview. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah.
Have a good day. Bye.